So my name is Noah Simblist. I'm a professor here in the Division of Art. And I'm pleased to introduce Franklin Sirmans, who's here from Los Angeles to talk about Prospect 3. So this conversation that we're going to have is a part of a series of visiting curators where they come, each curator will come a semester. So in the fall we had Dan Byers, who was meeting with students, who was here from the Carnegie Museum, and Franklin is here today. So this conversation is actually co-sponsored by UT Austin. So Franklin and I are actually traveling on the road. We're taking this to UT on Wednesday. But before introducing him, I just wanted to remind you of a couple things coming up. On a week from today, on April 20th, is Jason Salavon, an artist who is going to be talking about his work, and that'll be at 6:30 p.m. Also our BFA show, which opens May 2nd, which I hope you guys can come to as well, in the Pollock Gallery. So. A bit about Franklin. So I first met Franklin when he was at the Biennial in Houston, and I think it was for this exhibition that Odebega Jones and Associates had organized, which was Mining the Museum, where they had used some work from the museum and combined it with their own, and did these amazing sort of classroom sessions as a part of it. And one of those classroom sessions featured Amiri Baraka, who gave this kind of master class as a part of the exhibition. So Franklin, as I mentioned, lives and works in Los Angeles, where he's the department head and curator of the contemporary art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. From 2006 to 2009, as I mentioned, he was the curator of modern contemporary art at the Biennial in Houston, where the exhibitions he organized included Neo-Hoodoo Art for a Forgotten Faith, which also traveled to PS1 in New York and the Miami Art Museum. And before that, he was co-curator of Basquiat from 2005-2006 at the Brooklyn Museum, Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And he also co-curated Steve Wolfe on paper at the Menil and at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Sirmans was the 2007 recipient of the David C. Driscoll Prize awarded by the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. And in 2009, he received one of the first Gold Rush Awards given by the Rush Philanthropic Arts Foundation. Sirmans has also written essays for several exhibition catalogs and articles and reviews in publications such as the New York Times, Time Out New York, Essence, and Grand Street. And what he's here to talk about today is the Prospect 3, where he was the artistic director in New Orleans. So Franklin's going to talk at first to sort of give a little bit of an overview of the exhibition, show some images and a few videos, and then we're going to go sort of to a Q&A between he and I, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions and comments. So please join me in welcoming Franklin Sirmans.
Hi, thank you, Noah. I'm going to try and get through some of these images, and then maybe we'll play some in the background. And because video, I think, is so integral, we've sort of selected a few videos to show as well. It's really nice to be here. It's good to see friends and also, of course, a lot of people I don't know. And good to be in Texas. I think one of the first times I actually spoke about this exhibition before I knew exactly what it was at the Menil collection. So it's good to come back to the conversation. And many people were a part of the sort of conversation around conceiving of the show. So I'm really grateful to Noah and to Rachel Cook in Houston at Diverse Works, who presented the idea. And it's nice to have, we've had great criticism for the exhibition, and it's nice to see when people can invest a certain amount of time and actually either positively or negatively committing to a certain amount of time in relationship to the exhibition. and the ideas of the exhibition. So it was just really nice to talk with Noah and with Rachel and to think about how the show relates to other exhibitions, and it's really an important part of it for me. So let me say, we have the list up here. I was working on the exhibition for about 2.5 years, and I would say that I began thinking about these types of exhibitions, these biennial type of exhibitions, really intensely in the mid-90s. From 96 to 98, I was living in Milan, and 97 was a year like 2017, where you have what is a grand tour or whatever for these type of exhibitions, and thinking specifically about places like Sculpture Project in Münster, Documenta, of course, in Kassel, Venice. All of those were happening at the same summer. And so being there in 97 was an opportunity to take in all of those shows from, the close proximity in Europe. But then also, I think that what happened around that time was you had this confluence of other exhibitions that were becoming a part of the discussion. So Venice takes us back all the way to the 19th century. Documenta is so closely linked to being post-World War II. And we mentioned São Paulo, so that's 1955. And there, I think, was a conversation happening in places like Gwangju, where they had their maybe second or third biennial in 97. Istanbul was still in its early stages. Johannesburg, the second one was that year. And so you had this opening up of the conversation. You had people talking about it, I think, from distinctly different positions geographically, which of course leads to to different conversations. So I wrote about a lot of those exhibitions while working at Flash Art. I spoke to a lot of those curators while they were working on the exhibitions. And so it was a period of being able to try and think about it in a really intense way. And it occurred to me, with prospect in mind, that what I thought were the more successful shows were the ones in which their location was paramount to their discussion. Like, you could not imagine the exhibition existing anywhere else, that it was so much about context. And then if I thought about that part, the second part for me in thinking about New Orleans was the fact that this is an opportunity to talk about your moment specifically. And, it's one thing, I love working in the institution, but it's quite different. And in many ways, which I'm sure Noah and I will talk about. But that sort of speed and that sort of not really knowing what's going to happen is an integral part of this type of exhibition in a way that it could never be in the museum. So with that in mind, we tried to, we had 18 different venues, we had 50-something artists. It then became about, well, what drives the exhibition? It can't solely be about New Orleans. I think the Prospect One made a case for that in many ways in announcing itself as the American Biennial from this city, and it couldn't only be about the moment. Like, what are you trying to say about the moment? So I somehow gave myself a year and a half to just go to studio visits and see what artists were talking about and see what kept coming up as a recurring sort of themes. And in the course of one of those studio visits, the artist Sophie Lavoff, who is like myself from New York but was living in New Orleans, told me to read this book called The Moviegoer. And I found that the book, and I think we'll talk about it a little, but I found that the book provided a structure in which to enter into this city in a psychological way. And it's this little book written by Walker Percy. I like to say, it came out, I think it was 1961, And the following year, it was the National Book Award winner for fiction. And it beat out all these books that of course you've known and read. It beat out Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger, Catch-22, Revolutionary Road, and I always forget, well, there's another one I always forget. But those are pretty big. Big authors, big books. Walker Percy, sometimes, not everybody knows the name or even that one book, which was his most successful. So that provided a sort of structural way in, and I hope we'll touch on that. And in order to think about the moment and to think about location, then what were artists saying about location? So we worked very closely with all of the institutions that are in New Orleans. And I'm going to try and get through some of these so we can get to the conversation. So New Orleans Museum of Art became a place in which you could have this sort of historical conversation. The museum has been there since 1911. So it was a way to think about not only the location, the moment as it relates to contemporary artists, but also this was, for me, an occasion to think about from, say, the late 19th century to the present, and to try and think about what that means as far as these exhibition goes, to think about how art history is shaped via the art experience. And the one recurring thing that was in my mind in thinking about New Orleans Museum of Art and its position as being the sort of arbiter of cultural taste in 1911, when not everybody, of course, could actually go to this museum in New Orleans, was the fact that how do we talk about contemporary art or an avant-garde art practice in this country? For me, that meant looking at a place that I grew up going to very closely, Museum of Modern Art, and thinking about someone like Alfred Barr, who in the 1930s did a lot of exhibitions that were really about how do we see each other. And that became a sort of sub-theme for the entire exhibition. In fact, my essay, it relates specifically to that. But how do we see each other in ourselves? A lot of those shows, there were shows in the 30s at MoMA like African art, Native American art, pre-Columbian art. There were a lot of exhibitions that were specifically about the museum as a place to learn about people. They had a little bit more of an anthropological bent than perhaps we associate with the avant-garde now. All of that changes post-war period, Americans, abstract expressionism, taking the picture away or taking representation away, taking the figure away. So that was something that played a really strong role throughout the entire exhibition, but I think specifically at NOMA. And I say that thinking about how an exhibition could also be both of these things, how it could be anthropological and it could also be about an art experience that is something more grounded in a formal vocabulary. What you're seeing here, Fred Brown is somebody who had a special relationship to New Orleans. He's an artist, one of a few artists in the exhibition who I felt like was overlooked, and this was an opportunity to put them back into the conversation somewhat. He was active in New York in the 80s and early 90s, and was part of a real sort of a neo-expressionist moment. He showed at the Marlborough Gallery, showed regularly there. But what these paintings did was they did two things. And they allowed us to talk about New Orleans through its history, through its culture, its most pronounced form, music, because most of these portraits are of musicians. We had Wynton Marsalis in there, Billie Holiday, on and on. And so that relationship had to be acknowledged. One of the first things that people told me when I started working on the show was, how can you do a show like this about what kind of art in New Orleans, where New Orleans is this place that is all about food and music? If your exhibition doesn't have food and music, it's not an exhibition. So we tried to address some of those things in various ways. And music has been important for me in terms of past exhibitions as well. So it was a way to think through that. It also allowed us to deal with a very, very difficult space. I don't have an overarching view of the atrium of the New Orleans Museum of Art, but it's this classic sort of lobby room after you've made your way up through the feudal steps. And it's really hard to deal with as a space. We thought about hanging something from the ceiling, but that had already been done and I think played into people's imagination too much. So we came up with these paintings that happen to fit. 12 of them are all around the space perfectly in these little niches. Keeping in mind history, keeping in mind that idea of how we see each other and ourselves was a conversation that was furthered by, I don't know, an interest in Gauguin as an artist and as a person. And most specifically, it was triggered by this painting, Who Are We, What Are We, Where Are We Going?, which related specifically to what I think all of these biennials must do. Those are the questions that we're trying to ask. That's why we keep doing them every 2 years, every 2 or 3 years. And Prospect is now a triennial. So with that in mind, thinking about this artist who, in order to find himself in some way, ended up going to a place very, very far away from where he was living. He was active in Paris. He was part of a group of artists, and he left there a couple of times. And, you know, there are many ways, I think, to interpret the work, but it offered a real anchoring point. And what we were able to do was to put his work in conversation with other parts of the collection at NOMA. And so that was always an important thing. If you're going to deal with this space, the one space that has, or not the one, but one of a couple spaces that has an existing collection, how do you use that? How do you think about that? How do you see it in different ways? And so there happened to also be a Gauguin painting on glass windows that was in the collection of NOMA that was hanging next to this wonderful, amazing piece. And I was about to change, and how could I not possibly acknowledge this painting lives here in Dallas at the DMA. And we were fortunate to be able to include this work after it had been in the big exhibition that was traveling the year before. So if we look from Gauguin, we have my entry point, which is through a sort of Western canon. Then how do we think about it in terms of where we are in our hemisphere? Many people cite New Orleans as being the northernmost city in the Caribbean. So we think about it geographically in different ways. So in keeping with that sort of trajectory, the artist Tarsila do Amaral became a really important historical foundation in which to move forward with this idea. So if Gauguin is looking for himself in the other, Tarsila was trying to identify a collective self at a time when Brazil's identity on the quote-unquote world stage was probably still somewhat in flux, shall we say. She was part of a group of artists and friends who were known around anthropophagia, movement by her partner, Oswald de Andrade, in which they talk specifically about, in order for us to identify our true selves, we must eat our others, our European, our African, our native. And this is the only way that we will be presenting a true self. So it was that sort of push-pull between Gauguin and Tarsila. Now, Gauguin was there with the post-impressionists. Tarsila was 2 rooms over in a room with artists from her moment. Picasso was in there. Modigliani was in there. So it also provided another way of thinking through this collection. And back to that idea of the conversation with a history specific perhaps to the Museum of Modern Art. But I say specific, but I think it's indicative of a larger conversation within that moment. Jeffrey Gibson's installation was specifically influenced and inspired by the exhibition on Native American art that happened in MoMA in the 30s. So he was using elements of that as inspiration for his sculptures and even the placement of the work when he originally did it at Leah Gangatano's space in New York about a year prior to our exhibition. So we took elements from that. So you see this flag-like piece, which is, we recognize it as sculpture, as a hanging sort of textile sculpture, but it also related to blankets from the earlier exhibition. And so do the other works. You can see the mass in the background there. Will Ryman was outside and reminds me of the fact that, I think it has been discussed in some ways as being a biennial type project that was situated in a more institutional way than prior ones. And I would admit that, but there were these sort of elements outside as well that one would encounter. Will is important in this case also because the big gold house you see in the back here is also by Will Ryman. And so these guys are friends. Both of them deal a lot with a sort of Americana aspect that was important to the show. Alma Thomas, another one of those artists that, is deserving of a bigger spotlight. Has an exhibition up now in New York at Michael Rosenfeld Gallery. Alma, now we know that she's one of the artists included along with Robert Rauschenberg in one of the main rooms at the White House. And Michelle Obama has talked about the work specifically and appeared on, I think it was a Good Morning America show with this painting that's up at the White House. Her works in abstraction, she comes out of the Washington Color School and was working in the 50s and 60s in particular, but through the 90s, in fact. So she was an important presence for that conversation. Ed Clark, and I think part of being able to go into a place and not knowing it is to be conscious of how artists tell us about that space. And so there were several artists that were either born in New Orleans or live in New Orleans. Ed Clark is one of those, born there 1926, still making work, had an exhibition in LA last year, and is one of those artists who was in the military and ended up spending a lot of time in Europe and became an artist in a way in Paris in the 50s. He was very close with Joan Mitchell. Joan Mitchell Foundation has set up in New Orleans and is a really vital presence there. In fact, one of our venues is one of their residency buildings. And so they were very close, and it was an opportunity to see that work together again. The Mitchell painting is actually from the collection of NOMA. Huguette Galland, again, this was that type of project that allows you to sort of discover things that might not come up in other ways. And this is an artist I had no idea of before the exhibition. Born in Beirut, I think 1927 or 28, still alive, was a daughter of the first independent president of the country, and had this amazing life of leaving Beirut as a young woman who had already begun a family, living and working in Paris for some time, and then, ironically, moving to Venice, California, and living there for like 10 years in the 70s, 80s, and was a vital part of conversations with people like Ed Moses, and many others that were part of Obscene in Los Angeles, who are much better known. And the family still has the place there. I actually saw the paintings for the first time at the house in Venice. And of course, I work 10 miles away, so nice to be on a project in New Orleans about this international thing when the artist is right down the street. We ended up acquiring the little painting on the left there. And so there was this beautiful little room unto itself at NOMA where her work is. And I'm moving along to what I think is another crucial part of the puzzle, which is Basquiat on the Bayou, which turned into an exhibition unto itself. When I first began thinking about Basquiat's presence, I knew about certain paintings, and so I figured we get 2 or 3 of these paintings, you put them in the show, he's one of many artists with something very important to say, just like all the others. And with the sort of encouragement of our director, Brooke Anderson, we ended up making it into a full-on exhibition and did a new book, which allowed us to revisit many conversations. And among them is the fact that there are probably like 20 to 30 works that specifically deal with the American South, and even more specifically, the region specific to New Orleans. So it was an absolute no-brainer. This is somebody who made paintings called Undiscovered Genius of the Mississippi Delta, then made another one called Revised Undiscovered Genius of the Mississippi Delta. It's just too obvious. We couldn't get that painting because you might have heard it sold for $50 million in the process of working on the exhibition to a lender. It went from a lender in Connecticut to a lender in Switzerland who was relatively new as a collector, and they decided not to lend the painting. But of course, there are so many others. So from the same country, we got Zydeco, this amazing painting titled after the music specific to Southwest Louisiana. Below that, to the left, you see King Zulu, specific reference to Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was King Zulu, literally, at the Mardi Gras parade in 1949. It's just too specific. And then if you have music and you have the culture that is specific to there, then you also need spirituality. And so we got this wonderful painting, Eshu, which deals specifically with that, with the god of the crossroads. It's just all there. And then installation view. There's another painting in the exhibition called Natchez, Mississippi. I mean, it was just too perfect. And then another part that was at the same space, the Ogden Museum, was this part by Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick. And I'm really, really, really happy to say that they'll be in the next Venice Biennial that opens next month. So it's a couple that has been living and working in New Orleans for the last 40-something years. And they had been little shown outside of New Orleans. So this is one of the best things, I guess, that comes out of the show. Their work and what I knew was going to be an integral part of ideas around the exhibition was ideas around crime and punishment. And being in Louisiana, thinking about, our relationship to the American prison system was something that had to be a part of this exhibition. They have worked closely not only in their own work going in and out of Angola for the last 20 years, but also on the Innocence Project, and worked very closely with someone who was recently released. You see another photo there. Herbert Singleton, artist who brought up many issues around the idea of self-taught or vernacular art, something that I think was a big part of the Venice Biennial prior to our exhibition, something that I felt like was a perfect thing to address in the context of New Orleans, where people think of art in a much more organic way, shall we say. But the presence of it in the overall show became less important for me. But Herbert Singleton was somebody who had to be there, and he actually made or learned to make a lot of his work while in Angola. So some tough pieces by him. And that takes us to the Contemporary Art Center, and we'll stop there. So we'll just show a little bit of these clips, because the static image just doesn't do it.
C'est important que le film soit projeté dans un espace qui soit protégé, qui soit un espace qui soit entre guillemets construit et contrôlé par moi. Parce que comme le film est très dense en images et son son, c'est l'expérience de la densité en soi, il faut que ce soit un environnement protégé. Et c'est important aussi pour moi qu'on puisse le voir plusieurs fois. Parce que j'ai remarqué tout de suite que c'était quelque chose qui me faisait peur quand je faisais le montage, qu'il y avait ce rythme qui était très rapide et qu'il y avait plusieurs images en même temps. Je ne savais pas si un esprit humain allait trouver ça agréable.
So just to give you an idea of that piece, which is basically a history of the world told through the desktop. And you can see how, we see how artists control their images, even on the wild, wild internet, in that I can't possibly find a clip of more than, 30 seconds of the video playing by itself. And so you can see it's controlled by the gallery, and she's telling us how the work should be experienced ideally. And so, there's nothing I can do to come close to that, but we did everything with her and created an installation there. And David Zinke, artist originally from Peru, lives in Berlin, made that piece in collaboration with musicians in Cuba. And he's as much a musician as he is a visual artist. And so part of it was that bringing artists who were going to illuminate or perhaps have these sort of shared histories and experience. So like one of the nice things about his presence in New Orleans, and he came down early on and spent time there, was that he became part of this drumming circle in Congo Square, which is like the main sort of central square in New Orleans. And lastly,
So, so forgive the transition. So I saw Prospect in December, and as Franklin mentioned, our mutual friend Rachel Cook in Houston, and I had been talking a lot about some of the things that this particular iteration of Prospect brought up. So the few of the questions that I was thinking about kind of had to do with that. So the first that these two images are kind of connected to is about this sort of like global-local relationship, just because any biennial, like as Franklin mentioned earlier and also talks a lot about in the catalog, any biennial, especially the New Orleans with Prospect, and also the Sao Paulo biennial, which you had talked about in the catalog, especially the 1998 biennial, like really deals with that intersection of the local and global. So that's sort of a larger conversation and a question if you want to say a little bit more about.
Sure. I mean, New Orleans is also, I think, one of those cities of American cities and of art in American cities. It is very much dominated by the artist-run spaces. I think there are more artist-run spaces there than anywhere else, and that's where the meat of the conversation is. So you have a lot of schools. You know, we had work at Xavier, Tulane, Dillard, a couple others, and so it was an integral part of it. And I think when you have that kind of conversation happening, then you have people who are concerned about people who come in from somewhere else. And so one of the things was, how do you have that conversation? And so it was integral from day one.
Right.
And I think part of it was to make sure that there was this sense of, well, we're all doing it, or we're all working on it, or having a conversation or something. So artists reached out in that way, and then the spaces reached out in that way. Another thing was about, and what you bring up with these two pieces is where convergence, like you said.
Right.
And these two pieces, I mean, Andrea Fraser is an artist who was represented in a couple of ways by this sculpture here, which is called Discarded Fantasies. And the sculpture is made out of clothing that was worn during samba, or during carnival in Brazil. And so she actually did a whole project about learning how to samba, and then actually doing it and being a part of the big floats during carnival. So it was that performative aspect that led to this sculpture. And New Orleans being New Orleans and Mardi Gras, there's an obvious conversation with Brazil and with cultural things that have happened in both places. So I started the conversation with Andrea really early, and then we added a second piece because her artist mind got going. And she does these amazing things where she, like an actor or an actress, can take on many different roles all by herself. And so what she did, and this was a way of dealing with the local, like, as an artist, you know, for me, it's like kind of like get out of the way. Just you know the artist, let them figure it out, and then you talk about it later. And so with her, she went there, back and forth, she looked around, she's thinking, and she wondered about issues around race and segregation, something that was a part of the moviegoer. And she found a manuscript, after a lot of searching, she found a manuscript that actually, or transcript rather, of the court hearings around the desegregation of the floats during Mardi Gras. And believe it or not, this case only happened in 1991. So there were 12 people in the room arguing from, you know, various points of view, and she took on all of these characters and created a 1-hour performance that we did at the beginning and we did it at the end. I think she's still trying to edit the video. I can't find one. But it was one of those pieces where people in New Orleans were like, wow, you got it. And she really gave a reflection of place to people who knew it and those who didn't. Because of course she's dealing with some big universal naughty thing, but it's something so specific. I mean, some of the people on that court case obviously are around. And so it was incredible.
Do you know if anyone actually went?
I don't. And the second piece, which we showed a little bit of, the Propeller Group, was another case of I actually had no idea what they were going to do until the last minute. Like I knew that there was some sort of connection there. This is a group of 3 artists, 2 of whom are from Vietnam, 1 from United States. They met at CalArts and they have been working together for a while now. A lot of the work recently comes out of a Vietnamese context. And so in thinking about the rituals of mourning in New Orleans and the rituals of mourning that they see in Vietnam, they knew that it was almost exactly the same. And so they made this film exclusively in Vietnam with this story of life and death and the ritual of mourning this individual through this video. And then added another element in that the artist from New York, Christopher Myers, made instruments in which he actually made hybrid instruments from, you know, American instruments and Vietnamese instruments. So they're pretty funny looking. I mean, it's hard to get from the images. but we then displayed those as sculptures as unto themselves. And he also created uniforms that related very much to the local high schools. And I mean, in New Orleans, the thing that still amazes me is that like kids learn music there the way we talk about football in Texas, right? It's just, it's there. And in that case, it's also something that doesn't get discussed on such a gender-related level too.
Yeah.
So we had these uniforms that related to the high school marching bands, and then he took photographs of some of the kids in these uniforms, and that was part of the installation.
But one thing that both of these pieces kind of brings up a little bit that the show seemed to have at different points is this kind of the sort of haunting history of colonialism, which is true, like, you know, not only for artists in New Orleans, but from other parts of the world. And so this notion of the global South or possible echoes of those experiences.
Definitely. I mean, we tried to address that in some ways in the Contemporary Art Center. I think I might be the only one who actually saw it. Like, you came in through abstraction. It was, the whole windows were done by an artist named Lucia Coke from Brazil. And so you came in not only through abstraction, but through abstraction from Latin America specifically. And I thought that that was an important part of the discussion that we don't get enough. And so you entered into the first floor, which was predominantly abstract, a second floor, which began with an abstract room and then went representational. And then the third floor was like the Tower of Babel of international art that related to the world in a way. And there were aspects of Bollywood, aspects of Nollywood in there. So it was a way to try and bring people through that space and to maybe reconsider some of those issues, like you said, not only through the lens of New Orleans or even the United States, but through a much wider lens.
Okay, so then the next question, I'm going to pull up this image, really has to do with sort of the way that Katrina really, which you mentioned, like Katrina really framed the first biennial.
Yeah.
Like this Mark Bradford piece that's up here, his piece Mithra, which was this kind of famous arc that was about the wake of the floods. And then this piece on the left that I had experienced as a part of Prospect 3, this Blights Out, Home Court Crawl, which also involved this piece by Lisa Siegel. And I'm just wondering how, 10 years after, Katrina really affected the way that you were thinking through Prospect.
Yeah, for me, I had to say from the beginning many times that this is not a post-Katrina show. Just to try and find some distance on the first exhibition, and also to acknowledge that so much time had passed. It's been 10 years now, and so it wasn't something, it's something that affected everybody there and artists and in the studios, but it wasn't something that dominated the work that I saw. So I wanted to push away from it. We also decided from the very beginning that there would be no repeat artists from the first or second editions of the exhibition. So it was a way to jump off, but of course you can't, get away from it.
Sure.
If you walk to the venues or see the venues, you're bound to feel the differences between what was affected by that, by that event. And so Lisa Siegel's piece is as much, I think, is so perfect, and I didn't even think about it in many ways, but is so much about what it means to live in the United States as a lower class individual or as someone exists in poverty in this amazing 21st century country. Like literally, like these blocks of abandoned buildings, but they weren't abandoned from Katrina. They were abandoned because of blight and because of poverty and because of illiteracy and all of the multitude of problems that create those situations. So it was a perfect way. And Lisa was somebody whose work I know as being about putting abstraction into architectural and urban settings, like literally, like literally painting on buildings for 10 blocks through the city that you would notice if you were making a certain walk. But in this case, she came up with this and collaborated with a bunch of people whose concern was with these neighborhoods and trying to do something better in these neighborhoods. And so she used these elements of Suzanne Laurie Parks' poems that are really about everyday life, if you will. She wrote a poem every day for 365 days. And so they were about like the motion of living, and managed to put them on the sides of these buildings and on the fronts of these buildings. I mean, and so it was this basically a neighborhood installation, and held potlucks and helped raise money to go into redevelopment.
And the thing on the left, this performance, which basically was like the second line of music through this space, where they also collaborated with Junebug Theater Company to do these individual monologues at each of the sites to kind of activate them in a way.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking about this project kind of took on a life of its own. Can you speak about that, how that or maybe some other projects worked that way?
Yeah, I mean, like thinking about how, certain artists were going to react to the space in certain ways, and just like literally, like we had like 20, 25 artists who we sent down early and just said, okay, just go spend a few days and then develop a proposal from there. And so Lisa was one of those. William Cordova was one of those. Somebody who had spent a significant amount of time already in New Orleans, and I knew would have a relationship to there. Tamika Norris was one of those, and there are many others. But it was that sort of hands off, like, get out of the way.
Do your thing. So the next question, these are images of Paul Chan's project, Waiting for Godot, which was commissioned by Creative Time. And that was one of those projects that was sort of dealing with post-Katrina realities, which also had to do with blight or how Katrina had raised to the surface a lot of questions having to do with class and race and things like that. Yeah. But one of the things that people had reacted, there were some very positive reactions to this project, but on the other hand, some who sort of saw him as an outsider coming in. And I wonder how you had thought about that when you first began thinking about you being the artistic director of Prospect as someone who's not sort of born and raised and living there.
Well, luckily I had that time to just go down and do nothing but talk to artists and not only artists, but just stakeholders. Right. And just to, say I don't have any intentions, and just to have conversations with people and see what happened. There also were, I don't remember how many, but I'd say there are at least a dozen artists who either were born there or lived there. So that also made it much easier to navigate. Sophie Lavoff and Tamika Norris are both part of those artist-run initiatives that are so crucial to that city. So like literally that, that took care of that conversation in a way.
Right. Yeah, just by spending time and building relationships.
Yeah.
And you mentioned also, like, this is a still from William Cordova's piece. And this is another thing, view of Longview, which was another site. And I think they speak to the diversity of really different kinds of sites that were used. So how did you think about using different sites throughout the whole city?
I worked very closely with this woman, Ilva Rouse, who worked on the other two and lives there and knows the city super well. And she's the deputy director. And so she had these relationships. So we talked to many people, and some situations worked better than others. But it was always had to be making use of the diversity of space, because I knew that we were leaning heavily also on an institutional framework for some foundational things. you can't put Basquiat anywhere except for those two venues, the New Orleans Museum of Art or the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. And you can't put Gauguin anywhere but at New Orleans Museum of Art. So then how do you make use of the variety of space, especially with younger artists who are coming in and able to respond directly to not only the space, but to ideas at least that you thought were part of the project.
Right.
And Longview is one of those really special places. That's where Camille Henrot's installation was. And it's a little bit, off the beaten track. It was unto itself. There were only, I think, 4 artists there, but we had her video installation as a sort of anchor. And it's these gorgeous old gardens that were finished, I think, in the 40s. So it has this air of a time long ago.
Right.
It's sited on one of the main golf course, in fact, or the main country club. So it was kind of like this push-pull between that sense of, wow, this does not look like anywhere else where I would encounter the rest of the show. And then the other one on the right is William Cordova having this brass band actually play or shout, if you will, at General Robert E. Lee at Lee Circle. And so there was that conversation happening there. And obviously was a way of showing the city from a different, a completely different view.
And you mentioned earlier this, the moviegoer, and in the catalog you talk a lot about a sort of a list of books that you were thinking about. And one thing, I think something specific about those books would be interesting to hear, but also just the unique choice of picking novels as a starting point, because there are a lot of international curators who work on sort of biennials or triennials that often work from a kind of theoretical starting point. And I'm wondering how you think about the novel as being a novel way of working. I mean,
I've just come from that conversation and from writing as a foundation, and so I don't know. It's there. It's always there. It's this template, and like you mentioned Neo-Hoodoo. Neo-Hoodoo was formed off of a reading of a book called Mumbo Jumbo by Ishmael Reed. And Ishmael actually did the subtitle to the exhibition. And in that book, you're dealing with many of these same things. In fact, the book tells the story of these 4 people who are going to the House of Art Detention, which is located at 82nd Street and 5th Avenue in New York City, otherwise known as the Metropolitan Museum of Art. and they're going there to rescue the artifacts, like all the pre-Columbian stuff and the oceanic stuff. They're trying to get it out of there. So that obviously played into the conversation. I find and found at the beginning that Calvino and the sort of philosophical way that he deals with fiction is something that was, it's just there. And this idea of cities and how cities change, develop, and in some cases go away. Thinking about New Orleans, we've thought about Venice a lot. Not only because of the exhibition, but because of its proximity to water. That city changes, New Orleans changed, without even having to mention the hurricane. It's there. So it was a way of having, at least for me, more of a way to think forward, even if it was not something that needed to be addressed visually within the exhibition. We did have a quote from the Percy book at every venue as one entered into the space. So to remind oneself of some of the issues that are in that book. And in that book, it's a very quiet, soft, poetic conversation that is much about the city of New Orleans as it is about human relations, like what we're talking early 1960s. So yes, post-Brown versus Board of Education, but not really feeling the effects of post-Brown versus Board of Education. And in fact, New Orleans is the place where Plessy versus Ferguson happened in 1896 to establish Jim Crow in our country. So it's the perfect place in which to talk about some of those issues, and Percy deals with that in a way that is completely poetic and could go right by you. And that was the tenor or the tone that we wanted to have. And I think that shares something with the work of Calvino as well.
That's great. So I wonder if anyone from the audience has any questions or comments at this point. Yes.
I was wondering where Andrea Fraser is from.
She is from originally the Midwest, but she lives in Los Angeles. She's lived and taught in Los Angeles for many years at UCLA. An amazing and vital presence in Los Angeles and obviously outside of Los Angeles.
So she had a bit of, well, of course, I was there during the Watts riots and during that time period. So I don't know exactly how she is, but she looks about my age. I wonder, did you feel like she had a lot of catching up to do because of, or did she immediately fall into this conversation and this presentation that you did that sounds so fascinating to me? Was it theatrical presentation?
I think so much of her work is about, those ideas around how do we understand each other. So she's dealt with gender a lot as a topic. She has an amazingly funny piece. If you want to have a laugh and keep it art historical, check out this piece called Frank and His Little Carp, in which she goes to the museum in Bilbao and basically gives a tour according to her, which includes rubbing up against the walls that Frank Gehry has created in there. And it's absolutely hilarious. So she has this relationship to ideas of institutional critique as well that allow her, I think, to easily morph into conversations. The same way that she took on the role, or not the role because it's her, it becomes lived experience of being part of the samba parade in Brazil. It's also a way for her to think through, who am I?
Yeah, Andy.
When you're curating such a broad spectrum of local and global people, artists coming in, I just wonder, what is your kind of program or process to go out into the world and search for international artists to bring to that kind of space?
I was advised by my co-curators in my department, Rita Gonzalez and Christine Kim, and both of them also wrote in the catalog. And I also was advised by Jarrett Gregory, who's a part of our department. And I would also point out, in addition to that, within the catalog, there are about 20 to 30 younger critics and curators, including Rachel, who are also, sharing the conversations that they're having. And so I'm just listening to people and going around to shows. I went to Guangzhou, I went to Venice, I went to Documenta in the run-up. But it's just a combination of that. And for me, it was that was how I could sell it to my director to allow me to do the show. Because you have to act like you're not taking on a whole other project, even though you are. And so we just said, well, this is just the course of what we do. We're always looking at artists. We have a weekly meeting in which we tell each other what we've seen. So it was a way of using that conversation to widen the conversation.
Yeah.
I was curious, you have historical artists, living artists, intergenerational, even among it. You're installing the show, you look to sort of establish dialogues with work that's in proximity, sort of that conversation about ideas that crosses generations and history of the present.
To me, that's the fun part, and like I said, like I could feel, and if I were giving a tour, I would say that this is here. Each piece is there for a very specific reason, and in conversation with somebody else for a very specific reason. To me, hopefully, people get some of that, but it was absolutely integral. At the New Orleans Museum of Art, I was fortunate in that the curator who was there when I started working on the project was Miranda Lash. Miranda Lash was my co-curator at the Menil collection. And so she's now gone to the Speed, but she was there. So at NOMA, I actually pulled back a little bit and just said, okay, want to have these relationships with your collection. So her knowing the collection better, it was perfect. But we still, knew what was going to be near each other. At the Contemporary Art Center, which is the biggest venue and which included 30-something artists, it's the same thing, like coming through the abstraction downstairs and hopefully opening up this conversation that then becomes representational and figurative after you've had time to take in some of the general foundation.
Did any of it surprise you, or something happen, just aesthetically that you wouldn't think would happen?
Constantly. You made me think of one of the negative ones was that, there's an artist in the exhibition, I'd say one of the bigger pieces by an artist named Glenn Kino, and he kept telling me, don't worry about it, it's only gonna be this big, it's like this big. And it was huge. And it was like, wow, we really can't put anything else in this conversation now. And I love them, and it was like, okay, you got it. But it was these series of tanks, and we also had problems because we had a leak one night, and there's other work in there. It was an absolute nightmare. But it's a piece that had these tanks of living coral that have been applied to tanks, and it's this specific coral that actually tries to take over each other's land. So like that question of aggression that we put on ourselves maybe is something that can be seen as innate in this context. There were always surprises, and I see you have Lisa next to it, and that's what ended up going somewhat near Glenn, but I didn't know how that was going to work out, other than that, okay, part of the conversation, but spatially, there were some issues, to say the least.
Yeah.
If we could just depart for a moment from the prospect, I'd love to hear your thoughts or conversation about the catalog show that you did and the catalog.
Oh, yeah. Wow, it's been a minute. It's good to see you, Bill. That's an artist, I think, we try to have some degree of rhythm in thinking curatorially. And so you make me think first and foremost of working intensely with one artist. And especially when it's a living artist. And he had just as much control as I had about what was going into that exhibition. We put about a dozen pieces of his in conversation with works from the Menil collection. And this artist who I think in some ways tries to see himself in terms of a much bigger history of art. So it was ideal for that occasion. But that's one mode, and then working with a group show with 50-something artists is like the whole other thing. And you just try to juggle between that space. So I'm really happy to say now that we're opening a solo exhibition of, dare I say, an artist who's no longer living in June at LACMA. And that balance feels right. The Catalan show is something that I hold dear because there are those ways of being able to go deep with one artist, and it's that artist that I really respect in terms of the way they talk about images and art. And it reminds me, I don't know if we have the Tavares image somewhere, but Mauricio told me it's not about the work. And if you recall his exhibition at the Guggenheim, where an artist is given the opportunity to have a retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum, and what he does is he miniaturizes everything that he's done for the last 20 years and hangs it from the center of this museum, rather than borrow from any collector or anything. And it's an amazing thing to think about. But what he says is like, it's about the image. And I think so much of what we do with the internet and with word of mouth and the ability to move about so easily is about images and sometimes not about the experience. Now, Prospect, I think, is about experience, but Maurizio taught me so much about how to look at images. And there's a piece that we're looking for, there it is, by Tavares Strawn. And this piece was the most reproduced, not only in terms of publications, but more importantly, because of Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. So everybody feels like they know this image, whether they've seen the exhibition or not, which is a wonderful thing. And it's this piece called You Belong Here. And it just translates so well between its experience and its image. And that's something that really, I think, came from a discussion with Maurizio, at least for me. Tavares did it here. This is like a 20-something foot tall neon that he not only made, but then put on a barge that's at and periodically went up and down the Mississippi River so that people could see it from many different places. And that question of belonging was something that obviously is really important to New Orleans, and not specific, but important. Thank you.
I think that, yeah.
I have two questions. I want to ask you, who do you think was the main audience that you want to reach out to this annual, and if you could be really specific with your answer? And my second question is, what are your conceptual strategies to make your writing more accessible for those that don't have an educational background or an arts training?
One, everybody. Two, what we did was we enlisted people in the form of docents, in the form of artists, in the form of educators who were at all of the venues. We were although we didn't have the money to do it, we did as much as we could in terms of PR. And we had bus stop signs. So I think that was one way, bus and trolley, that was one way to really let people know what was happening. We were on radio every day during the 2 weeks before the exhibition opened. So we tried to utilize everything at our disposal. And then I think the other layer is people and having people in those spaces. One other way that we didn't talk about was, the idea was that there was a poem and a soundtrack to the exhibition. So Ricky Laurentis is a young poet, went to Sarah Lawrence, teaches at Washington University, and he's from there. And he has written about there. And so he wrote a poem specifically in relation to his experience as a New Orleanian and also as someone who was responding to the list of artists very early on. So that was in the book, and it was also in like brochures and in a newspaper. We worked closely with the New Orleans Advocate, which is, New Orleans is one of these cities where the newspaper actually does not exist on a daily level anymore, the main one, the Picayune. So the New Orleans Advocate has come up recently and filled some of that void, and they were real partners. So they created a pullout that went in every single one of their newspapers for like a month. So, we tried to utilize all those different ways, and that had the poem in it, and it had the soundtrack in it. The soundtrack was created by a DJ in New Orleans, and her name is DJ Soul Sister, in which she created a list of all of her like most inspiring or songs that related to New Orleans and to her upbringing in New Orleans. And that's like an integral part of what her DJing repertoire is. So then now you have DJ Soul Sister, who has a radio show every Saturday night before she goes to do her show called Hustle at not far from two of the venues. And so she was a part of the exhibition. And so was Ricky in some ways. We also were lucky in the sense that, New Orleans being a somewhat smaller city, it's amazing how people come out and what people will do. So we also benefited from a partnership with Texas own Solange Knowles, who lives there. And so we did a party together at the end. And her Instagram helped, shall we say. So there were just those kind of things.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to call it a night. But thank you all for being here, and thank you to Franklin.